Welcome, folks. We're just getting folks coming in. We're going to start here in about another minute. And the format will be discussion. So if you have some questions for Courtney that involve utilization of native plants or prairie restoration, you can go ahead and start putting them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and feeding the questions to Courtney as we go along. She's got lots of things that she can talk about, even if there are no questions in the chat. We've got, both Retta and I've got a list of questions to ask her. But it might be nice if you guys had your specific questions that you wanted to see addressed. So far, just sitting here talking with her, we've been talking about prairies in the ditches, roadside prairies, and how oftentimes those roadside prairies are some of our best, some of our most diverse and healthiest pieces of prairie that we have left. Welcome, Barb. Welcome, Mike. Welcome, Bess. Thanks for coming. Welcome, Zachary. Good to have you guys here. We're going to get started in just about one more minute. So we were talking about how to potentially protect those roadside prairies from spraying and from mowing, because oftentimes the plants are just getting to maturity and blooming when they get mowed. So it's kind of frustrating for those of us that have been appreciating the ditches. Okay. We've got people coming in. Welcome, folks. Welcome, Jan and Maureen. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. My name is Jill Hocus, and my co-host is Retta Kramer, and we represent the Friends of Konza Prairie and the symposium series. We'll be offering a speaker like Courtney every month on the last Tuesday of the month at noon. And we will be recording these and making these programs available on the Konza Prairie YouTube channel. So if I know you guys are here, but if there's others that have wanted to see or listen to the program, they will be available on the Konza Prairie YouTube channel there. And so today we're lucky to have with us Courtney Masterson. She is the owner and manager of Native Lands LLC. She is a botanist and a passionate protector of the prairies. She is somebody who has devoted her life to bringing back prairies with prairie restoration, with encouraging the incorporation of native plants into even our backyard. They could be tiny landscapes. And so this is going to be a give and take open discussion with Courtney. If you want, it could be just me and Courtney talking, because we've already found out that we could talk forever just talking about different topics. But we would really like for you to put your questions into the chat. And Retta is going to be monitoring the chat, and she'll be reading the questions out for Courtney to answer. But I'm going to go ahead and start things off with a common question. And for you, Courtney, how would you suggest somebody get started in restoring a prairie? What are the basic first steps?
Oh, man. And, transparency, everyone. Jill gave me a heads up about this question. And it honestly depends on where you're at. But I'll give a couple of examples, because there's themes to this. Some folks have recognized wildflowers underneath red cedars, for instance, and they need to reclaim that space. And honestly, even though it looks really daunting, that's going to be one of the easier problems to manage with prairie, because red cedars die if you cut them, and you don't have to worry about herbicides or repeated resprouting or things like that. But then there's other issues, like invasive species that are non-native and cause us long-term problems, like Sericea, Lespedeza, or Johnson grass, or Old World bluestem, and how do we deal with those? And each one's going to require its own management plan. But for most people who either have recently purchased or recently inherited, or just recently realized what they had, prairie, I like to start with a prescribed burn if you can do it. If you've got enough space that you can mow around your native space, or if you don't have cedars throughout the whole property, starting with a burn is a great way to lift the dead vegetation off of the space and awaken any native plants or seeds that have been hiding there. And sometimes it also wakes up some plants that aren't so great, and it's good to know they're there. So I like to start with cleaning the site with fire. And if you can't do that, getting a good brush hog on there, or even grazing it, so that you can get the vegetation off of it, so that we can see what's there. And then, get a plant survey done if you can. Not everybody's going to have access to a botanist, and I know that. You can reach out to your local conservation district for recommendations, and I'm happy to come out when I can. Or, I have a couple of colleagues out where you are, surely. You need to know what you have so that you know how to manage it. Usually the goals for managing prairie are increasing diversity, reducing woody cover, and managing invasive species. And that sounds easy, but it's really not. So that's not a very clear answer, but that's where I would start. See what you've got, and then learn how to tackle those things, increasing your diversity.
We do have a question. How do I make up for not burning or grazing my urban 8x25 prairie for show?
Right. So in an urban space, we do have clients that are lucky enough to be in just the right situation where they can burn their gardens off. If you can't, though, finding some way to trim the dead vegetation back every other spring or so, or every spring if you have the energy and the time to do it. We do our garden cleanups right about now. Once you see bees and butterflies, it's time to get in there and start cutting it back. And even then, I don't compost that stuff immediately. If you have the space to set it to the side and let the animals emerge from it, that's the way to go. But yeah, you can't really burn some urban plantings, right? It's just not safe. And it is a little bit more manual labor when you have that. You can go in with you can rent or borrow a more industrial weed whacker. I know some folks do that. That'll cut anything down. But I didn't tend to do all my garden cleanup in urban areas by hand with hedge trimmers and soil, hoary knives. It just takes more time.
We have kind of a follow-up question to that. What's the best way to start a native plant garden in an urban setting?
So I wish it was as easy as I wish I could just write a starter guide. But again, it's really different for everyone. What's your soil like? What's already there? For most people, there's some sort of turf grass or weedy seeds in the soil. I start with as much site prep as you can do. And even if your long-term goal isn't perfection and you're okay with a few weeds in your garden, it's still better to clean the site as well as you can before you start. For a lot of our clients, they don't want to use herbicides, and that's going to be a common theme in folks interested in native gardening. If you're not interested in herbicides, or even if you're not worried about them, but you have time, I would smother the site with cardboard or plastic, or I use heavy duty tarps, and pin them down for honestly 6 months. I know that sounds terrible. Nobody wants to hear that. The reason that you do that is because not only are you trying to kill the vegetation that's there, but you're trying to get the seeds underneath that material to germinate and die. So it takes some time to do that. Often folks will put cardboard down, leave it for 2 months, take it off for a couple of weeks, let the seeds germinate, put the cardboard back down for 2 months. And that's going to be the most effective way without using herbicides. If you do feel comfortable with really responsible use of herbicides in your garden space, you could treat the site once and then wait a month and then treat it again. I know that sounds crazy, but The herbicides doesn't affect most seeds, and you want those seeds to sense that it's okay to germinate so that you can also whack those. If it's a tiny garden space, you could get away with pulling all of the existing vegetation out or cutting the sod off. But just know that if you cut the sod off, you're taking all that really amazing soil with it. And I don't like to, my number one goal for installation of gardens is to minimize soil disturbance. Even in urban areas, there's a little bit of soil structure if the site's been undisturbed for a few decades, and you just want to preserve that as much as you can.
So let's talk a little bit about, okay, so we've got our site prepped, right? And we have removed as many of the unwanted seeds and seedlings from the soil as we possibly can, whether we've done it with herbicides or we've done it with the tarp. What is the best way to introduce new species with already transplanted plants, which is going to be work intensive, or with a seed, like a broadcast seed mixture? What do you think?
I employ both methods when I'm putting gardens in, and this is the theme of ecologists, by the way. There is no black and white answer. I wish it was, but I usually do a marriage of both if it's a large space. If you have the luxury of time, and really you do, unless you have some sort of garden show you're trying to prepare for really quickly. The reason I say that is because native seeds really should be sown in late fall, early winter, and then you're not going to reap the rewards of those seeds in some cases for 2 or 3 years. I mean, you're going to see them germinate that first spring, but it may be 3 years before they bloom. And while seed blends tend to be the more affordable way to go, that's not always true depending on the species that you choose. And most seed blends just are not going to be native to your space. There's no one out there probably selling a Konza Prairie seed blend or a Manhattan, Kansas seed blend that's going to be native to your county, to your region. You can get close with some of the seed blends sold online. If I have to buy a blend that's pre-made, I use Missouri Wildflower Nurseries seed blends. Even theirs contain some species that are native to Missouri, not Kansas. And so I don't like to use any pre-made blends, but it's a really great way to start if you're just getting going with native seeds. Another place you could look is Prairie Moon Nurseries seed blends. Again, a lot of northern tallgrass prairie species in that blend. And what's going to happen is they're just not going to do well. You'll see the species that are native to your area do okay. And the species that belong in Minnesota probably aren't going to last long in your garden. And that's why I do customized blends for our clients for their counties rather than wasting their money on seeds that just won't do well. On the other side of that, plugs. I buy native plant plugs for most of our garden installations because you get an immediate reward from that. It's going to bloom the first year, and it's going to start dumping seeds on the site the first year, which is really nice. So rather than buying Blazing Star seeds that will take 3 years to bloom, I might install 2 Blazing Stars. And that first year, they're going to produce hundreds of seeds and dump them all over the site. And you'll start seeing more Blazing Star over time. So investing in both is a smart move.
We have another question that kind of goes back to disturbing the soil involving turf grass. Does removing the sod in non-native lawns destroy the soil basis?
Yeah. Even though there's not a lot of benefit to turf grass, it's anchoring that first 3 or 4 inches of soil. And for most folks, unless you're living in a newly established space, that lawn has been there for decades. And it's host to a much smaller suite of organisms than prairie soil is, but it's still going to have some fungal species, worms, other organisms that would be a benefit to your garden in the long run. So if you cut deep enough to get turf off, which is going to be 3, 4, 5 inches, you're taking all of that nice organic material away.
And then we have a question that kind of veers off a little bit differently. Is it bad for the health of a tiny urban prairie to never be burned or grazed?
It's going to be hard on some native species to never be burned or grazed. I think you can emulate the grazing by, hand clipping it, and that's going to be okay for a lot of species. There are a very small suite of prairie species that just don't do well if they're not burned. You're not likely to see those in a small fragment of prairie or in a planted space because they're hard to get your hands on. So I think you're going to be okay. It's not great. I love burning. It's the best tool for prairie management, I think. But you're okay clipping it yourself. Borrow somebody's goat. No, don't. Don't.
I think you've pretty much touched on this next question, but I'm going to put it out there just in case there's some more. When wanting to put in native gardens, what's your take on trying to maintain local ecotypes of species instead of mixing genetics from other areas? Is that something to consider?
That is a goal of mine, to try to use as local an ecotype source as possible, and that goes for plants and seeds. It's a difficult restriction for me to put on people because that's just not available. Okay, great. Thanks for your patience, everybody. So a local ecotype is essentially going to be plant material that contains the genetics that hail from your region. So the butterfly milkweed in Konza looks quite different than the butterfly milkweed up here in the Lawrence Douglas County area. So, and that's not just because they're, what's our next question, Retta?
Well, we had, I'm backing up here just a little bit because I was continuing to read. We had a couple of postings on where to get seed and those types of things, but how about seed? Here's the question. How about seeding immediately with annuals such as Giardia? I'm going to butcher the pronunciations.
Okay.
Patella, Coreopsis, Tinderella, and they could bloom immediately and they're gorgeous for urban native plant gardens. So planting right away.
Right. Some of those annuals are still going to need a cold season, but not all of them. And you're right, blanket flower, some of the annual Coreopsis species will bloom that first year. And I think they're really great cover crop, essentially, for your longer to establish native plants. I even have clients who have used things like zinnias or marigolds as cover crops while your native plants establish. So that's a really great way to make your native garden pretty while your species that require 2-3 years to look nice mature. That's a smart idea.
So I have a question for you, Courtney. This is Jill. Do you have reliable resources for purchasing plants, native plants that we could go to?
Yes, it's hard to answer for everyone since you probably all live in different spaces, but I use a lot of our local nurseries up here in Northeast Kansas for plants. So if you're driving through the area, check out the lists for native plant sales on Deep Roots KC's social media and website, as well as native plant sales for Grassland Heritage Foundation, Monarch Watch. If I have to order something through the mail because I don't have a nursery nearby that sells native plants, I use Missouri Wildflower Nursery. I trust them, and their plants are affordable and they ship really quickly. So I could order plants for a job I need next week, and I can be sure I'll have them. They also sell seeds, and I really like them for seeds. You can absolutely purchase plants from a nursery that's a little further from where you live, but because of that local ecotype discussion, they may not be best suited to your site. So if I order plants from Prairie Moon Nursery in the northern part of the Tallgrass Prairie region, it's because I'm pretty desperate. I really, really want that species for some reason. Otherwise, if it's something you could find more locally, I would recommend doing that. A lot of the Kansas City sales and the sales here in the Lawrence area, you can pre-order plants and just drive by and pick them up. And then the nurseries you can pop into here in Kansas City, there's 3 that I use. One's called Happy Apples Farm, and she's a good friend of mine. I supply her seeds, so they are super local ecotype seeds. And then Green Thumb Gardens and So Wild Natives in Kansas City also sell native plants the entire growing season, and you can walk in and shop just like any other garden store.
So another question I have for you is the viability of perennial plant seeds. Have you noticed that there's a relatively low percentage of viability in the perennial prairie plant seeds?
Right. So a little bit of that's going to depend on where you got your seeds from. So if you got seeds that someone collected from their garden or from the prairie, those are going to have a really low germination rate, generally speaking. Not for all species, but generally speaking, you're going to look at something like 20 or 40% germination rate. Even if you do all of the cold stratification and the scarification, it's still going to be a pretty low germination rate. If you're buying seeds from a seed production company like Missouri Wildflower Nursery or Phi Brothers or Sharp Brothers, or we use Hamilton Native Outpost for really, really big projects. They have to test their seeds with the state. They have to have a certain germination rate. They breed the native plants, and select good looking seeds. So you're going to have a little bit higher, but across the board, native species are going to have a lower germination rate in general. So always plan ahead. Probably if you have experience gardening and you use a certain number of seeds, you probably want to double that for native seeds. So
a different topic, slightly different topic, gardening for specific species. So,
yes.
So let's talk about species of plants that you would recommend for people who want to bring in butterflies, for example.
Oh, wow. So that butterfly gardening and bee gardening, for that matter, are more complicated because you want to provide not just the nectar and pollen for them to eat, but also the plants to support them throughout their entire life cycle. So if I was going to garden for a monarch population, for instance, not only would I plant milkweed, but I would make sure that I always have something native blooming year round, and that I have some structural elements, something shrubby or woody, something for the monarch to use to put its chrysalis on. So they don't actually put the chrysalis on milkweed. They often wander off and lay their or put their chrysalis up somewhere else. And usually that's going to be a nearby tree or your deck or something like that. You're railing on your porch, which is inconvenient. So, but for bees, most of our bees are going to overwinter in the ground or in hollow stems in your garden. So making sure you don't cut down the standing dead vegetation until around this time every year, and making sure you have something blooming all of the time for bees is really important, and not just what you want to be blooming. I think that's maybe the biggest shift for gardeners who have been doing this for a really long time. Even if you see a bee or a butterfly use a plant that you've planted that's not native, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's getting the nutrients that it needs to survive. So some non-native plants are attractive or smell good or maybe even taste good, but there's been really interesting research on whether or not nutritionally that plant is a good substitute for a native plant. So making sure you have food that the organism you're trying to support has evolved with is really important. And I could go on. I garden, for instance, for specific bees because I like certain species. So the blue sage bee is my favorite species of bee. It's the most beautiful bee of all time. I'm just going to say I'm biased. And they really love blue sage, our native salvia. So I make sure that all of my gardens have Salvia azurea in them because I want to be that island for that bee. So I love the idea of gardening for a specific organism. So if you have a specific thing that you're gardening for and you have questions, now's the time to do that. Ask those and I can try to help.
Well, and early spring, oftentimes about the only thing that's blooming that's available for these first bees is dandelions. And so yes. I don't know about other people, but I keep a large section of my lawn unmowed and let the dandelions just go to town. And what's interesting is looking at them, there's bees on almost all of them, on all the bloom. And
Yes.
so dandelions are a great early spring nectar source for our bees.
They are. Dandelions, violets, a lot of the things that we try to kick out of our lawns. And I understand, there's going to be people who want to have their lawn space, but try to provide, like Jill said, a space where I always pick, a 10-foot by 20, 30-foot space in my yard that I don't mow. And I might shift that space around, once a month so that I don't harm the little bit of grass that we keep. But by doing that, I'm allowing the flowers that are part of our lawn to bloom and the pollinators to nectar there.
Yeah, between the henbit and the dandelions, they're just completely covered with insects, and it's a really cool thing to witness. If you give your lawn a chance to do that, you're going to see results.
Absolutely. And it's really difficult for folks who have been managing lawn for a long time to accept the weeds that you've been managing all this time. But just choosing a small portion of your space to devote to wildlife and beyond the bees and butterflies that use those, they make nice lures for the rabbits that are eating your tomatoes, and it makes a nice lure for mice to keep them out of the house. So that way you anticipate wildlife using that space, and you can be cautious when then walking through there yourself.
We have a question about the level of imperfection that's acceptable. For example, we have loads of bees right now on both the red buds and the non-native shoulder belt maples. So should we keep the maple?
So I try very, very hard to not be a purist with all of our clients and students. I think if you're seeing animals use it and it's not causing you any harm, it's not pushing back on a native space, then you can set a long-term goal to transition that space if you'd like. Plant some young native trees or native shrubs underneath the maples now, and consider, as the maples fail in health, take them down slowly. I don't think there's any reason to clear things out unless you're a hardcore, switching to all native plants and you'd like to clear them out. Then I'm in full support of you. There's a lot of really great native trees for wildlife. But right now the maples are probably providing some structure for birds and squirrels and hawks. Not that they're not birds, but I think of hawks every time I see big trees. So slow transitions make a lot of sense in that situation.
So let's talk about one tree there's several trees, but at least one tree that does need to go if you have it, and that's the Bradford Pear.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
So share with me, your thoughts about the Bradford Pear.
I try really hard to be nice. But the calorie pear, the Bradford pear, there's a lot of names for this exact same species. The calorie pear was introduced a long time ago. It was thought to be sterile. And it's still sort of a pet tree for a lot of people in orchards and permaculture movements. And my big beef with it is that if you drive through several counties in Kansas, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, even now, you'll see the massive invasion of calorie pear into our wild spaces. So we try to encourage people not to plant those things and talk about native species that are more appropriate. But not only are they just kind of crappy trees, they break really easily in storms. They spread without fail. They're going to be everywhere. If they're not in your yard, they're in your neighbor's yard. And they don't provide for wildlife. While you'll see honeybees on the flowers, though I don't know how you could get that close to one of those flowers. It's disgusting. They smell terrible. We'll see honeybees on those flowers, but you really won't see native bees unless they're super generalist bees on that tree, and they don't produce food that anyone will eat. It's just a junk tree, and it's a super conservation concern. I spend a lot of time cutting them out, and they're thorny, which if you've ever tried to work on trees in a prairie, you don't need the added benefit of thorns to make your life harder.
So if one were to take out pear trees, what would you recommend instead of them?
Oh, there's so many good things. Obviously, site conditions are important. You can always plant an oak. Number one best tree, right? There's a lot of research on why you should always plant an oak if you're going to plant a tree. But depending on the size, if you want something that's about the same size as the Callery pear, then you might want a smaller tree. I really like some of the slower growing trees that I love are native, the American hazelnut, Ohio buckeye, redbuds and serviceberries and pawpaws make fantastic trees, and they produce food for us, which is great. I could go on and on about native trees, but I think it's important if you live in a prairie county, and a lot of us do, thinking about what your long-term goals are, and how much tree you really need. If it's providing you shade, plant something that's going to hold on to its leaves as long as possible. So I plant a lot of red oaks and bur oaks for that reason, if I really want shade. And you can feel comfortable planting red, black, bur oaks, a lot of the oaks in prairie that are native to your county, because they're fire resistant, and they won't spread aggressively. The fire will manage the smaller oaks, but will let the bigger oaks live. But yeah, thinking about what your tree goals are. I only plant woody things that produce food for me or wildlife. And that means I'm working within the suite that's native to my region.
Okay, so you've hit some of your favorite trees. What are some of your favorite shrubs to plant for wildlife or for prairie
shrubs
health?
Are so cool. Most of my prairie gardens, if I'm going to put a shrubby element into it, I'll use something like golden currants, which is one of our native berries, or lead plant. I really love lead plant. Elderberry, because it's fantastic medicine and a really great pollinator plant, and has its own insects that use its leaves, which are very beautiful. So many, Jill. Black chokeberry, Aronia melanocarpa, is an all-around stunning shrub, produces berries that taste like currants, and it's scarlet red in the fall. So if you're trying to replace a burning bush, the black chokeberry or Aronia is a great choice. I could go on and on.
Well, I had a favorite elderberry along my road. It was just wild. That was huge, and then of course the county came by and mowed it. So I went and found two elderberries at a local nursery. Really excited to find them because they're hard to find, and so pulled out the pear tree, and I'm planting a red bud and two elderberries. So we're all doing our part.
That'll be very pretty. That'll be very pretty, and the elderberry in the ditch might come back. They do. I cut some of our elderberries. I cut to the ground on purpose every year because they can get so tall if they get to be a funny shape. So they're one of those species that you could cut to the ground every year, but they like to thicket. So when you're choosing a space for an elderberry, either give it space to fill in. They're really nice for windbreaks, hedgerows, ditches, various spaces that they can fill in, or just tell it where it's allowed to be and cut the stems off that you don't want there that year.
We do have another question here. Someone's curious about why are pollinators important in prairie ecosystems if most plants reproduce asexually?
That's actually, that's a good question. They don't most reproduce asexually. Many of them have the capability of reproducing asexually, but man, I wish I can go back to my intro biology stuff here. The value of sexual reproduction is that there's diversity in your genetic code to protect you if there's some sort of a threat. And many of those threats are viral, or the great locust invasions of major pest problems, fungal problems. If all of the plants were the exact same, clone, so that really just one individual and was particularly susceptible to a disease. So I was just saying the benefit to the prairie of sexual reproduction is resilience, really. Being as resilient as possible no matter the situation. And we encourage, that you have multiple members of that species or garden so it can, sexually reproduce, that you introduce seeds over time where you need to. Is there any portion of that question I didn't answer? Sorry.
Well, and then you've also got we're supporting pollinators so they can do other work as well. So the pollinators can be part of the ecosystem as well. Even if they're not actively pollinating something, you still want them to be around to be a member of the ecosystem. So the plants are supporting the pollinators are supporting the plants. It's all part of the system.
Right, and those if you don't care, I understand. I've met people who like bugs. Even if you don't care about the pollinators, the birds that use that eat those insects are probably attractive to you, or the animals that eat the birds. Somewhere in that food chain is an animal that you care about, and the plants are 100% dependent. In the long, asexual reproduction is only going to take you so far. So over the course of 20, 30, 40, 100 years.
There she is.
I'm sorry. I'm going to try a different internet source, but okay. So I don't know if you got all of that, but somewhere in the food chain, there's an animal dependent on that plant's survival. So I'd say sexual reproduction is really, really important. What's our next question, Retta?
Well, one question is, as we do all of these things, we pull the seed, we get seeds and we get plants planted. We have to have patience, but how can we measure along the way that we're being successful in creating a prairie garden?
Great. Yeah, I think, I'm gonna take this from someone else, which was, it's gonna sound funny, but I was listening to someone talk about how can you know you've been successful in your counseling, or if you've gone to see a therapist. I know this sounds crazy, but write down your goals before you start. If your goal is diversity or providing habitat for a particular animal, write that down somewhere before you start this journey, or do it now if you've already started. And then when you get a year from now, look back at that goal and think if you've taken steps towards achieving that goal. For me, most of the time, my goal is providing for wildlife, and and that generally means having as much diversity in my garden as I can sustain. And sometimes that means there's multiple gardens, or sometimes it means I need to be realistic with myself and stop adding so many species and making things look messy. So I think writing down a goal and working towards that goal and taking status checks regularly, each growing season, think about that goal. That's how you know if you're successful. And if you see wildlife using it, ultimately we're native gardening for things beyond ourselves. So if you're the only one using that space, if that's all that matters to you, that's okay. But if the goal is greater than you, then you'll have your answer.
Did you see the question, Retta, that Margie was saying, let's talk about the value of insects beyond pollination?
It just popped in. Okay.
Yeah, Margie, you are so right. And I probably cut out when I was talking about that. Insects are food for so many animals. I mean, first off, birds, but if you think even beyond that, snakes, lizards, mice, other rodents. And then if you think of all the animals that are dependent on those animals for survival, One of my favorite hawks, the red-shouldered hawk, specializes in eating snakes. And if I don't provide for, the mice that the snake eats, then I'm not providing for the hawk. So you have to think about the whole ecosystem when you think about insects in your garden space.
What are some of the surprises you've encountered doing restorations?
Oh, good question. Some of my favorite surprises are when I show up to a space where my client is 100% sure that they don't have anything native growing on their property and it's just a mess. And people are often really embarrassed by their land. I'm not saying it happens every time, but some of the best surprises are when you show up and you're like, actually, this species you have over here in the corner where you don't mow all the time, that's a really sensitive prairie species, or, oh, that's a really valuable woodland species. And so finding trout lilies or prairie fawn lilies, or someone dug up and brought to me a plant from their pasture the other day that ended up being a super, super rare prairie wildflower. And I told them, we should start managing that like prairie. That is not something that would just show up. And that's true of a lot of our more sensitive prairie species. If you see larkspur or hoary puccoon or, Mead's milkweed, if you know what you're looking for, you could have something really special growing on your property. And that's why even though you could do all of this by yourself, it's nice to reach out to your resources and have somebody who knows prairie or woodlands really well come by and just walk the property with you. You might be surprised what you have.
We have another question too, a little different bent. You see a lot of clients with the goal of offsetting their carbon footprint, and is that obtainable in an urban restoration?
Ooh, great question. There is some emerging research on tallgrass prairies and carbon sequestration. There is a lot of evidence to support the idea that those deep-rooted native grasses and native forbs are storing carbon. And even in a small space, the roots underground are doing a lot of work for us. So there's every reason to believe that planting a native restoration in an urban area would pull carbon from the environment and store it underground. Some of the best analogies relating prairie to what we classically think of carbon sequestration in trees and rainforests is there's a lot going on under that soil. Your 15, 20 feet of root growth in thick, anchoring root systems can store a lot of carbon. And as long as that site can be protected, it can store it indefinitely. And what's cool about prairie roots is a good portion of a prairie plant's roots do die back each year and reform each year. So you're getting carbon sequestration every year. And that's something most people don't realize. They think that, once that prairie grass has reached its full height, then it's done all of its work to store carbon. And that's not true. It's pretty magical. We're learning more about it all the time. More reason to protect prairies because largely we don't understand them as much as we think we know. We don't know it all. That's for sure.
We have a question back to pollinators a little bit. If our goal is pollinators, should we focus more on a large diversity of plant species or having fewer species but large enough populations to support those pollinators?
That is a really great question, and they're both valid methods. I think if you can focus at least on having blooms each season, so there's always something blooming in your garden, you can keep things a little more simple, but just realize that some pollinators just won't see the species in your garden because they just didn't evolve to recognize those plants, or they have specialized mouth parts or body parts that require them to interact with certain plants. So to maximize insect diversity in your garden, you would want to maximize to the best of your ability the plant diversity in your garden. But I do recognize that there's an aesthetic to this. And as much as I want to have 100 species in a 10-foot by 10-foot space, that's not sustainable, nor would it look all that great. And individual species may really struggle if they don't have partners of their same species in the garden. So It's going to depend on the wildlife you're trying to support and your particular space, but try to find that happy medium between aesthetically pleasing, but also providing resources all year.
Courtney, in my butterfly garden, I worked really hard to put in a bunch of different species of milkweeds. And I noticed that the butterfly milkweed is not a preferred species for nectaring. Have you found that as well?
Right. It's actually, I don't see an awful lot of pollinators on my butterfly milkweed. I think the swallowtails use them every once in a while. And, I'll see bees on them every once in a while, but it's used by monarch caterpillars mostly, and it's very attractive to me. So it's not going to be the hardest working milkweed in your garden, that's for sure, but it may be the most eye-catching. So if your goal is monarch food and nectar and you only have room for one milkweed, you might choose, even though the orange is so cool, you might choose a different milkweed to do that job.
So follow that up. What are your favorite milkweeds for a butterfly garden?
So I try to always have, and this is a tall order, but I try to always have antelope horn or spider milkweed in the garden because it is a super early milkweed. And when monarchs pass over us the first time, it may be the only milkweed available to them. So monarchs are actually starting to pass over Kansas now. And if you think about it, how big is your milkweed? It's not very big. And some of the largest ones right now are going to be those spring milkweeds, like the antelope horn. And then I like to have a milkweed that's going to last through the heat and into the fall. So my favorite summer milkweed is purple milkweed. It is, in my opinion, the most attractive milkweed in the world. But everybody likes a different big milkweed, even though it is probably the preferred host plant of monarchs. I don't usually use common milkweed in my gardens unless you have a very large garden space or a naturalized area like acreage to plant on. Common milkweed isn't really appropriate for the garden because it'll throw roots 20, 30 feet into the yard and you'll be mowing over it all the time. Or, it just won't be in the right place at the right time. So I recommend something a little better behaved. And think of the small statured milkweeds. They do a lot of work. I see monarchs on our world milkweed all the time, and it's just gorgeous. It's very slender. It kind of hides in the garden. But, it's used by pollinators and really easy to control if you don't like where it's going because it's only a foot tall. I really like that.
I said that. The next question was about world milkweed. Someone commented that they had heard it was toxic to monarchs and was wondering if that was true.
Oh, no. They love it. What's funny about world milkweed is that the leaves are so slender. I like to watch the monarchs on it because they can bite through the whole width of the leaf with one bite. And so they just chomp down it like a spaghetti noodle. And they can go through world milkweed really fast because of that. And that's one of the ways you can control that population in your garden is just let the monarchs, manage the population.
I've never seen world milkweed available as a small plant.
I think you can get it from Missouri Wildflower Nursery. I know I can order trays of it from Taylor Creek Nursery up here in Northeast Kansas in Baldwin City. And they are allowing some commercial sale now. So if you live in the area, you can pick up in Baldwin City, but you have to order by the tray. So ask all your friends if they want world milkweed because you'll get 32 of them. And then, you can have world milkweed, or just ask Courtney because I order some every year. I'm happy to get some in.
Well, I was going to say, what about the aphids? That was one thing that I had a whole bunch of aphids on my swamp milkweed last year. And I actually just left them. I left them for the other critters to eat.
Yes, exactly. That's my methodology, unless I'm working in a garden where the milkweed's pretty isolated and there's not currently a good functioning ecosystem in that garden. So if it's a brand new garden space and we're not seeing any of the predator insects in that space yet, spiders and assassin beetles and, ladybugs, then you might use some soapy water to clean them off. But if you don't know, the yellow aphids, and I'm sure Jill knows this, but the yellow aphids are non-native. They're oleander aphids. They were introduced. The other aphids, black aphids, red aphids, brown aphids, those are native. So the predator insects in your ecosystem know how to deal with aphids. And if you have the patience for it, they will catch up and eat them, and the plant will recover. That's what's so nice about perennial gardening. You might have a bad year, but the plant will be okay. What I don't like is when the aphids are so numerous that they seem to bother the monarch caterpillars sometimes. That really bothers me.
Oh, right. Yeah. Last year was a super good year for assassin bugs. Yeah, mine were well fed.
Yeah, it was a really good year for them. And I have an irrational fear of wheel bugs. And if you guys know what I'm talking about, they are intimidating insects. And they're really harmless unless you pinch it against your body or accidentally press it against your body. Then it's not great. But they do so much good work for us in the garden. And so I've learned to, anytime I see one, to spend time with it, so that I can recognize it for how wonderful it is. But they are scary to me. I do not know why. They have big siphons on their faces. That's why. Giant needles on their faces.
All right. Any other questions? It's 12:56. We are going to wrap this up. I'm going to send you, Courtney, I've got an amazing picture of a wheel bug killing a June beetle. And so I'll send that to you. Yeah.
I need it. I want to see it. I like to confront my fears. Send me all the wheel bug pictures.
I've got a bunch of them. Thank you so much, Courtney. This has been great. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, and thanks for being patient with my ridiculous internet. I would love to talk to you guys anytime, and thank you for being here. Hi, Margie. And listen to Jill. She's amazing. I hope you have a whole lot more really amazing speakers too, and I'll be around.
Thank you so much, Courtney. You have a good rest of your day. Thank you, folks, for coming. We appreciate you for joining us, and we will see you next month.